Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to UJAR, Unpam Mengajar. Hi, I'm Rui Soekarno, your nobody hero for poetry, because the real hero is you. Today I'm going to share with a deep color of feeling about what is poetry and how to read it. In this session, I'll share you the definition, the example of poetry to help you beautifully understand and appreciate it, and also how to read it with the most precious emotion to catch the tone of poem. So if you're ready, heroes, let's get it loud, keep watching and don't miss it. Stay tuned on Sasmita Jaya TV, berbagi untuk negeri. Well, the next is many sets of words explaining about poetry can be regarded as the definition of poetry. To make an alignment among those claims of definition, we need to take one to represent all explanation. And in adapted paper from Sound and Sense, an introduction to poetry by Arp and Perrin, it is stated that poetry is as universal as language and almost as ancient. The most primitive people have used it and the most civilized have cultivated it, states by Rose. Meanwhile, Froese states that poetry is when an emotion has found its touch and the touch has found words. Poetry has been written and eagerly read or listened to by all kinds of people in all ages and in all countries. Furthermore, it is believed that the intelligent and the sensitive individual appreciate it greatly, and it has appealed in its simpler form to the uneducated and to children due to some reasons. It because give pleasure. People have read it, listened to it, or recite it because they like it or because it gave them enjoyment. Nonetheless, this is not the whole answer. It is stated, poetry in all ages has been regarded as important work, not simply as a form of amusement. Rather, it has been regarded as something central to existence, something having unique value to the fully realized life, something without which we are spiritually impoverished. To understand the reason for this, we need to have an understanding of what poetry is, professional, because people have always been more successful at appreciating poetry than at defining it. Welcome back to our program, heroes. Thus, the importance of the existence of the poetry is not as simple as being an amusement. Poetry has an important role in communicating an important thing in life in more unique way. It is stated that people are more successful in appreciating poetry, although it is not as successful as when they are defining it. The work of poetry might be difficult to be defined due to the variation of meaning from its language, may lead the reader to the variation of interpretation. However, the beauty of its language arrangement can be appreciated by even general readers who are not exclusively learning the work. Here's the example of poetry. To find and prove poetry always beautiful is as in the poem of Winter by William Shakespeare from Love's Labour's Lost. Here is the poem, Winter by William Shakespeare. When icicles hangs by the wall, and Dick the shepherd blow his nail, and Tom bears logs into the hole, and milks come frozen home in pail, when blood is nip and waist be full. The nightly sings the staring all, to-ho, to-hit, to-ho, a merry note. While greasy John doth kill the pot, when all aloud the wind doth blow, and coughing drown the parson's soul. And birds sit brooding in the snow, and Marian's nose looks red and raw. When roasted crab is in the bowl, the nightly sings the sharing all, to-hoo, to-hit, to-hoo, a merry note, while greasy John doth kill the pot. Well, heroes, in this poem, Shakespeare communicates the quality of winter life around 16th century English country house. But he does not do so by telling us flatly that winter in this such surrounding is cold and in many respects unpleasant, though with some pleasant feature too. The adjective cold, unpleasant, and pleasant are not even used in the poem. Instead, he provides a series of concrete homely details that suggest these qualities and enable us imaginatively to experience this winter life ourselves. The shepherd blows on his fingernail to warm his hand. The milk freezes in the pail between the coals and the kitchen. The cook is slovenly and unclean, greasy, either from spatter cooking fat or from her own sweat as she leans over the hot fire. The roads are muddy. The folk listening to the parson have colds. The bird sit brooding in the snow, and the servant girl's nose is raw from cold. But pleasant things are in the prospect. Tom is bringing in the logs for the fire. The hot cider or ale is ready for drinking, and the soup or stew will soon be ready. In contrast, with all this familiar detail of country, life is the mournful and weary note of the old. Obviously, the poem contains no moral. If we limit ourselves to looking in poetry for some lesson, message, or noble truth about life, we are bound to be disappointed. These limited approaches sees poetry as a kind of sugar-coated pill, a wholesome truth or lesson made palatable by being put into pretty words. That what this narrow approach really wants is a sermon, not a poem, but something inspirational. Yet winter, which has appealed to reader for more than 4 centuries, it is not inspirational and contain no moral preachment. Neither is the poem Winter's Beautiful. Though it is appealing in its way and contain elements of beauty, there is a little that is really beautiful in red. Raw noses, coughing in chapel, neighbor blood, full road, and greasy cook. Yet, the second limiting approach may lead us to feel that poetry deals exclusively with beauty, with sunset, flower, butterfly, love, God, and the one appropriate response to any poem is, after a moment of our silence, is not that beautiful. But this narrow approach excludes a large proportion of poetry. The function of poetry is sometimes to be ugly rather than beautiful, and poetry may deal with common cold and greasy cook as legitimately as with sunset and flower. Poetry takes all life as its province. Its primary concern is not with beauty, not with philosophical truth, not with persuasion, but with experience. Beauty and philosophical truth are aspects of experience, and the poet is often engaged with them. But poetry as a whole is concerned with all kinds of experience, beautiful or ugly, strange or common, noble or ignoble, actual or imaginary. Paradoxically, an artist can transform even the most unpleasant or painful experience into work of great beauty, and emotional power. Encountered in real life, pain and death are not pleasurable for most people, but we may read and reread poems about this subject because of their ability to enlighten and move us. A real life experience that makes us cry is usually an unhappy one, got it? But if we cry while reading a great novel or poem, it is because we are deeply moved, our humanity affirmed. Well, the next is about poetry and its function, heroes. The act of communication involved in reading poetry is like the act of communication involved in receiving a message by radio. Two devices are required, a transmitting station and a receiving set. The completeness of the communication depends on both the power and clarity of the transmitter and the sensitivity and tuning of receiver. When a person reads a poem and no experience is received, either the poem is not a good poem or the reader is not properly tuned. With new poetry, we cannot always be sure which is at fault. With older poetry, if it has acquired critical acceptance has been enjoyed by generation of good reader, we may assume that the receiving set is at fault. Fortunately, the fault is not irremediable. Though we cannot all become expert readers, we can become good enough to find both pleasure and value in much good poetry. Or we can increase the amount of pleasure we already find in poetry and the number of kinds of poetry in which we find it. The purpose of this episode is to help you increase your sensitivity and range as receiving set. Poetry, finally, is kind of multi-dimensional language, ordinary language. The kind that we use to communicate information is one-dimensional. It is directed not only part of the listener, the understanding, it is one dimension is intellectual. Poetry, which is language used to communicate experience, has at least 4 dimensions. If it is to communicate experience, it must be directed at the whole person, not just at your understanding. It must involve not only your intelligence, but also your sense, emotion, and imagination. To the intellectual dimension, poetry adds a sensuous dimension, an emotional dimension, and an imaginative dimension. Poetry achieves its extra dimension, its greater pressure for word, and its greater tension per poem. By drawing more fully and more consistently than does ordinary language on a number of language resources, none of which is peculiar to poetry. These variation resources from the subject of number of the following episode, among them are connotation, imagery, metaphor, symbol, paradox, irony, allusion, sound repetition, rhythm, and pattern. Using these resources and the material of life, the poet shape and make a poem. Successful poetry is a never effusive language. If it is to come alive, it must be cunningly put together and as efficiently organized as a tree. It must be an organism whose every part serves a useful purpose and cooperate with every other part to preserve and express the life that is within it. Well, the last topic of our discussion is reading the poem. What is the central purpose of the poem? Our only reliable evidence of the poem's purpose is the poem itself. The purpose may be to tell a story, to reveal human character, to impart a vivid impression of a scene, to express a mood or emotion, or to convey vividly some idea or attitude. Whatever the purpose is, we must determine it for ourselves and define it mentally as precisely as possible. Only by relating the various details in the poem to the central purpose or theme can we fully understand their function and meaning. Only then can we begin to assess the value of the poem and determine whether it is a good one or a poor one. Poetry is written to be heard. Its meaning are conveyed through sound as well as through print. Every word is therefore important. The best way to read a poem is just the opposite of the best way to read a newspaper. Only read the newspaper as rapidly as possible. One should read a poem as slowly as possible. When you cannot read a poem aloud, lip read it. Form the word with your tongue and mouth, even though you do not use your tongue. With ordinary reading material, lip reading is a bad habit. With poetry, it is a good habit. Always pay careful attention to what the poem is saying. Third, you should be conscious of the sound of the poem. You should never be so exclusively conscious of them that you pay no attention to what the poem means. For some readers, reading a poem is like getting on board a rhythmical roller coaster. One should make the utmost effort to follow the thought continuously and to grasp the full implication and suggestion. Because a poem says so much, several readings may be necessary. But on your very first reading, you should determine the subject of the verb and the antecedent of the pronouns. Practice reading the poem aloud. When you find you especially like, make friends listen to it. Try to read it to them in such a way that they will like it too. Read it affectionately. Read it affectionately, but not affectedly. It is not necessary to put emotion into reading a poem. The emotion is already there. Reading too fast offers the greater danger than reading too slow. Read slowly enough that each word is clear and distinct and that the meaning has time to sink it. Read the poem so that the rhythmical pattern is felt but not exaggerated. Remember that poetry, with few exceptions, is written in sentences, just as prose, and that punctuation is a signal that as to how it should be read. One starting point for understanding a poem at the simplest level, and for clearing up misunderstanding is to paraphrase its content or part of its content. To paraphrase a poem means to restate it in a different language so as to make its prose sense as plain as possible. The paraphrase may be longer or shorter than the poem, but it should contain all the ideas in the poem in such a way as to make them clear to a puzzled reader and to make the central idea or theme or the poem more accessible. Who is the speaker? Who is the speaker and what is the occasion? To aid us in the understanding of a poem, we may ask ourselves a number of questions about it. Two of the most important are who is the speaker and what is the occasion. Sometimes even our idea in a poem will help us to understand the poet's life. More importantly for us, knowledge of the poet's life may help us understand a poem. And here are some general questions that will help you read, understand, and appreciate poetry. First, who is the speaker? What kind of person is the speaker? Next, is there an identifiable audience for the speaker? What can you know about this audience? What is the occasion? What is the setting in time? For instance, our session, century, etc. What is the setting in place? Whether this is indoor or out, city or country, land or sea, region, country, etc. Next, what is the central purpose of the poem? What is the tone of the poem? How is it achieved? Why is this type of poem an appropriate means to communicate the author's theme? Discuss the diction, the word choice of the poem. Discuss the diction, the word choice of the poem. Point out words that are particularly well chosen and explain why. Next, discuss the imagery of the poem. What kind of imagery are used? Is there any structure to the imagery? Point out explain any symbols. If the poem is allegorical, explain the allegory. Point out example of figurative languages. What is their function? Why are they used? Point out and explain any allusion. What is their function? Why are they used? Well, the primary purpose of this unit is develop your ability to understand and appreciate poetry. Here are some preliminary suggestions. Number one, read a poem more than once. A good poem will no more yield its full meaning on a single reading than will a Beethoven symphony on a single hearing. Two reading may be necessary simply to let you get your bearings. The second one, keep a dictionary by you and use it. It is futile to try to understand a poetry without troubling to learn the meaning of the words of which it is composed. The third, read so as to hear the sounds of the word in your mind. So, heroes, that's all my explanation about what is poetry and reading it. Keep appreciating in your bad and good time. Be happy and romantic. Thank you very much for your attention and see you in the next episode. Salam UJAR. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.